All right, good morning. We're going to get started on Chapter 9, Lesson 1, which is Evidence of Evolution. So again, we're looking at evidence or support for the theory of evolution, and we know that evolution is change over time. And very important to note that individual organisms do not evolve. All right. So a single individual cannot change over time. Okay, evolution takes place over many generations. All right, an individual organism can adapt, but cannot evolve. All right, so again, this is the theory that explains how living things descended or came from earlier organisms. And if we look at very easy example to identify with is a woolly mammoth. On page 357, you can see the woolly mammoth. I think we all have a pretty good idea of what that thing looks like. It went extinct about 11,000 years ago. Okay, and then we look at our modern day elephant. Very similar. We can infer that these two organisms descended from a common ancestor. Saber-tooth tiger, if you remember the skull that I had in the classroom, it's actually a replica saber-tooth tiger skull. A picture of that organism, and we'll talk about fossils here in a little bit, but looking at the fossils found of that organism, it's very easy to infer that that organism and the Bengal tiger share a common ancestor. So what we're going to look at today are the 4 pieces of evidence that support this theory of evolution. Okay, and those are fossils, similarities in DNA, similar body structures, and then early patterns of development. And we're going to go through each one of these now. So if we look at fossils, you know that fossils are the bones or structures of organisms that lived long ago. Scientists can actually infer a lot about individual fossils. Okay, they can infer how they moved if we look at their bone structure. Okay, ball and socket joints with flat feet can tell us that an organism how it moved, how it ran. And we can also tell what kind of diet that organism had based on the type of their teeth and jaw structure. An organism with a lot of flat, broad teeth, was not a carnivore, and that's not a tooth type that is conducive for shearing off pieces of meat. As opposed to if you look at your dog or cat's teeth, and those teeth in the back are specifically designed for cutting meat. So we can tell a lot about how that organism moved and what its diet was. Excuse me. This fossil is actually really cool. I've seen this in person countless times. This particular fossil was actually in a museum at the university where I went to grad school. So they estimate this by carbon dating, estimate this to be between 78 and 85 million years old. And it was found by a farmer out in the middle of a field in western Kansas. So this fish right here is about 14 feet long. And if you look inside down here where the fish's stomach would be, there's a 6-foot fish right here. And you can see the perfect skeleton of a fish that it consumed shortly before it died. So a couple of things I want you to think about. What would a fish this size be doing out in the middle of a field in western Kansas? And typically we associate organisms this large living in the ocean, not in the middle of a soybean field in western Kansas. So think about that. We're going to have an activity that deals with similar scenarios tomorrow. So similarities in DNA. Once scientists were able to look at DNA and break down the entire genome of individual organisms, scientists were able to infer that individuals with the same genes more than likely came from a common ancestor. And again, we're going to get into that next chapter and what a gene is, but a gene is just a segment of DNA, all right, that determines a specific characteristic, all right. And the more similar the DNA sequences are, the more closely a species is related. Your book doesn't really go into this very much, but a couple examples here are if we look at the DNA between wolves and domestic dogs. Okay, so in their mitochondrial DNA, about 99.8% of their DNA between a wolf and a domestic dog is identical. Okay, so just that 0.2% gives us the difference between a wolf and a domestic dog. Also, our closest living relative, okay, is the chimpanzee and the bonobo. They're two very, very similar organisms. You've probably not heard of a bonobo before. We're the only great ape that is able to swim, okay? And chimpanzees and bonobos are separated by the Congo River. Because they cannot swim, this natural landform separated the two, and example of divergent evolution, created two different species. But humans share about 99% of our DNA with chimpanzees and bonobos. Okay, very, very closely related. Excuse me. Again, evidence that supports that we came from a common ancestor. All right, so similarities in body structure. Now, you guys have you've heard me talk about homologous structures before. Okay, we know that the prefix homo means same. So here we're looking at a body plan of all vertebrate animals, okay, animals that belong to the phylum Chordata, provides evidence that they evolved from a common ancestor. Again, we're talking about a long time ago. Okay, so again, like I just mentioned, homologous structures, and we're over on page 360 right now. Okay, similar structures that are related. Okay, I'm sorry, let me start over there. Similar structures that related species, okay, have it inherited from a common ancestor. We look at okay, the picture on 360, which including the bird in there is not really an example of a homologous structure. Okay, a better example would be a bat's wing, a dolphin's flipper, and a dog's leg. Here we're talking all mammals. Okay, if we look at this picture, okay, we have again all of our mammals here. We have one long, large bone, okay, in the forearm, okay, humerus. If we move down, there's an elbow joint in all of these animals, okay, and then two bones of the forearm, the ulna and the radius. Okay, your cat, a whale has two bones, okay, as well as a bat. Moving down, okay, they all have some small wrist bones, which would be our carpals. Okay, and then our phalanges. So if we look here, okay, we know this would be an example of adapting to a specific environment. And bats have evolved wings, and the whale evolved flippers, but the internal structure remains the same. And this is, again, this example of what is called homologous structures. And this is another piece of evidence that supports a organism or organisms coming from a common ancestor, okay, supporting the theory of evolution. Coming back here, I've already talked about humans and chimpanzees. We're looking at what would be the top of the right hand, okay? Very, very similar between the gorilla the human and the chimpanzees. And we can see the 3 joints of the phalanges. Okay, we have our metacarpals, our carpals here. Okay, we all have this. These 3 organisms have this saddle joint that gives us our opposable thumb. Now, looking at the panda, this is an example of something that is called an analogous structure. Okay, structures that look similar but have evolved based on environment rather than common ancestor. Because you can see the panda actually has 5 fingers, and then it has this little false thumb that enables it to grip its food, bamboo, but it's not opposable. The panda doesn't have control of this thumb. It's not opposable, similar to the dew claw on your dog. Okay, that little claw that's up on his forearm, and it helps him grasp objects. Okay, not an example of homologous structures. These 3 are. Okay, this does support the theory of evolution here. Okay, talking more about analogous structures, analogous structures are an example of convergent evolution. Okay, animals that are different, but the structures serve a similar function. A bird's wing and a dragonfly's wing. And these 2 organisms are not closely related at all, but have evolved wings to make them better suited for their environment. And like I said before, analogous structures are not an indicator of a common ancestor. Rather, it's due to the fact that they live in similar environments. And if we look here, we have a fish, bird, and a dolphin. Okay, not closely related. You can see the analogous structures of the flipper look similar, wing, fin, and flipper. They look similar because of the environment that they live in, but this is not an example of a homologous structure. These are analogous, again, which is not a piece of evidence that supports common ancestry or evolution. The final piece of support for evolution that we're going to look at are similarities in early development. If you think back to when we were doing pregnancy and birth, we looked at the development of the human, and it wasn't until pretty late on in development that it actually started to look like a human. So hopefully you remember those pictures from that lesson. Okay, so again, the last piece we're going to look at, this is 361. Scientists also infer evolutionary relationships by looking at early development of that organism. Okay. 361, they have a picture of a chicken, a fish, a turtle, and a pig. And if you look at the early stage of the development of those 4 organisms, they look very, very similar. Okay. I have a similar picture here where there's a fish, amphibian, a reptile, bird, and then 2 mammals. Okay. Our fish, salamander, tortoise, our chicken, rabbit, and human. If you look at the early stages of development, every single one of these organisms has gill slits. Okay. Obviously, we don't breathe through gills, but in our early stages of development, there are noticeable gill slits. Okay, we don't have a tail, but in our early stages of development, you guys probably remember this, it looked like we had a little tail. If I put all of these organisms up here without their labels, there's a good chance we can't distinguish one from another. So again, similarities in early stages of development is the 4th piece of evidence that supports the theory of evolution. All right, so that's lesson 1. Oh, forgot about that one. That's just a funny. Very important to note. I know some of you People in the past have gotten wound up. This is just a joke. I'm not suggesting that we came from chimpanzees. All right. It is just a joke. All right. I'll be back here in a little bit and we'll talk about Darwin's theory in lesson 2. And there's a lot of information in there. And if you have any questions, post them to this thread. Have a good day.